Hey guys, welcome back to the Hoosier Garage, and we're going to be working on some primer today. Two types of primer. We've done a series on epoxy in the past. I'm going through and I've blocked sand most of this side of the van. Okay, we're pretty accurate here. There's maybe some other areas that'll poke up, but they would be minute compared to what we had before, as of like last week. Okay, we got some bare steel here. We've got some epoxy primer area here that we've done some other work on, and so we got some bare spots. So we're going to have to reprime this. We're going to have to fully prime this area. But the main concentration right here that we're going to talk about today is 2K primer. Since we have the body work within reason, it's time to make sure that everything's covered in epoxy. Okay. Once you do that and you get everything straightened out, best of your ability, then you go to the 2K primer. It's a sanding or sandable filler type primer, and that'll help you get rid of all the little imperfections. Also help you, if you block it really good, it'll affect that final presentation when you do put the paint on it. It's not the final primer coat, but it's the one out there in the middle. So stay tuned for that here in the Hoosier Garage. Day, almost 24 hours. I would say when you do any of the primer work, give it at least 12 hours before you go mess around with anything. As a habit, I tend to mess around in the garage and want to touch stuff. So my whole thing last night, after I painted or primed what you just saw me do, I made sure to shut the lights off, go out and do something totally different, because I was still very active yesterday and wanted to do something. So I did some yard work. So just get out of the shop, resist that urge to stir up dust or touch anything. So right here, what we're looking at, it's a very tan colored stuff. That's the 2K primer. Now you can get it in the tan or you can get it in gray. This is the Nason, same brand as the epoxy I use, and it's 421-17 with the activator, which is 483-87. Select prime and select seal. Select prime 2K. And again, this is something that will provide a buffer, kind of a filler coat, a sandable coat to put over top of this. Because one thing you'll notice when you look at the van is you see the body work, okay? You see where we have filler. Usually the kind of the darker, fuzzier area, that's where we had filler. You can see it all telegraphed right through the epoxy. So you'll want to use the 2K. It'll help neutralize everything here, and it'll fill in any slight inconsistencies. One of them being possibly this right here, a very, very slight dimple that my block kept taking out. And there's also a little spot here that's like actually it's like an indentation. It can help fill that, and just any other assorted things. Since this van had a lot of surface rust, some areas like right here, you can see where the old scale was, but I couldn't get enough filler in there to stay. When you would block it, it would just kind of vibrate it or drag it out. So the filler primer adds a nice thick, kind of a chalky layer that allows you to block sand it with anything lighter than an 80 grit is what I prefer. So like 120, 180. And then if you want to get a little more detail, you go down to 320 with it. You get it really smooth, blow it off and wipe it down, and then you put another coat of this on there. And what this will do is add a sealer coat to all of that, because it's a little more porous, the 2K, which is this stuff again. And so this will add a sealer, and you can even get one called sealer through the Nason line. I have used it. It's usually a darker gray, almost a slate gray color. But you can also use the epoxy primer as the sealer, and that's probably what I will do this time. Filling this thing up with some 2K. I put a little bit of reducer in there for the amount we got, just enough to allow it to loosen it up a little bit, because this stuff is pretty thick, okay? And by the time you put the activator in there, it's going to be a little bit thicker. So that'll help it flow out better. You can use a different tip in some cases. But if you put a few coats of this, let it flash, put another coat on, you'll pretty much equal the thickness that you would have if you didn't use any of the reducer at all. I usually have to use a reducer because I don't have a bunch of different tips. I just use what I have. And it's just a little Harbor Freight gun or a Husky gun. I've used just a few different ones. This is a 4-to-1 ratio. Here. 4-to-1, so you get 4 part this, 1 part that, which is why the size differential. That'll tell you a little bit about it. Make sure you get the lid back on your 2K. It does like to spin over kind of fast. We'll go ahead and get our activator going here. And I would recommend using the measurement cups. I can usually get within the ballpark. Right there. Make sure we get our lid on there. And you can either stir it up by hand. This wastes less by not using a stick or anything. And then let it set about 3 or 4 minutes and be ready to spray. And I think for the sake of showing you some of the coverage, especially as it starts to flash, which is kind of a drying time after you shoot it, from your angle you can see the reflection off the ground, and you can see the body work like we talked about earlier, how it transmits it through the epoxy primer. So as I spray this, you'll see that disappear and look more neutral, nice and flat, nice and even. It'll just be this kind of goofy tan color. So here it is. Pretty good coverage, nice and thick. Gives us some material to sand on. It's not perfect, but we can maybe work it down a little bit more in certain areas where, like this body line was a concern. I might have to tweak a little bit. We can go through and spot prime if we have to get it back to looking like this, and then obviously we'll block sand it, and like I said earlier, we'll hit it with a seal coat of epoxy when we're done and happy with this, and it'll pretty much be ready for paint. Okay, so only like 3 or 4 hours later, this is rock solid dry. That's the good thing about 2K. It has a lot of solids in it and it just dries up good. But here we need to do some block sanding, and that's like lightweight block sanding. Let me see what we need here. So to be real honest with you, I'm just gonna be a little scared and stick with 320. Nice soft grit and this block. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't want to get out the little round block. I don't want to get the long block. I just want to make everything nice and slick. Okay. Now I drove the van out about 10 feet into the sunlight just to kind of take a look, because you're always going to see a little bit more in the sunlight than you will under fluorescent lights or any other kind of artificial light. And I did notice back here our line that I worked on just a little bit off. So I'm going to try to just work it around. I might have to break the 2K coat just a little bit, and we might have to fix it. But at least you know at this point it's just very isolated little moves from here on out. So I'm going to get started on block sanding. It's not too bad a deal. It's not too terrible, really. I mean, you're just going to go through it. It has a really, hear that? Really sandy, chalky texture. Alright, so about an hour, 15 minutes, I block sanded all of this. Cross hatched both ways as much as I could. You'll rub through this at times, that's completely fine. Like mainly on the edges. There are occasional slightly high spots. I have two right here, but you'll never see them. They're so slight, and also they're so slight that the thickness of this tan color 2K coming up to that helps even that out more. That's the purpose of this stuff. It's not super thick, no, but it does do the job in a lot of areas like that. Now my body line where I did the quarter panel here, and it had its own line, but frankly the line wasn't deep enough where you would see the dark shadow right here from the original part of the body. So I actually brought it out a little bit. Is it perfect? No. One thing that you can cheat on though, I have a stripe that's going to go on here. The stripe's going to kick up somewhere in here, okay? So it'll hide a lot of that. If that makes you comfortable, you do that. If it doesn't, or you're not going to have a stripe, you might want to work a little more on it. I could work more on it, probably put several hours in it, and be moderately happy with it. My thing is when I get the gray on it, here's the seal time. If it bothers me then, that's my last chance. I might even touch it up then, but I might not. We'll have to feel our way around with that. So if that bugs you, that's cool. On your project, you can go the extra step. But I think we might be able to get away with this. That's really my only area of reservation on this bodywork. Everything else has come out really good. Because if you are familiar with our videos, very early on, obviously this panel I just spoke about, and it cut off about right here down. This whole panel from here down is brand new. We haven't gotten around to it, but this cab corner down here is brand new. The rocker panel down here under the door is brand new. These areas right here and here are the areas that you have to meld into the original part of the body. That's the challenge. That's not so bad there because you're just basically cutting and pasting there. Overall, it's pretty good. Again, I'm not a professional, but I do know that this works. This has worked for me in the past, and if you do it cleanly and efficiently, it'll work for you too, okay? So I'm gonna blow this off, I'm gonna wipe it down, clean it up a little bit, we're gonna cover the wheels again, and we're gonna put our seal coat on of epoxy primer. Okay, now it's time for the epoxy primer. All right, this is the first thing you put on the better steel, and this is pretty much the last thing you put on before you paint it. The 2K primer is something, just a reminder, it'll go in the middle. It's a middleman type of situation. And while it was 4-to-1 ratio on the 2K, on the epoxy primer, we went over to this before, it's a 1-to-1. Now yeah, this kind of throws you off seeing this small cylindrical can with this big gallon here. So they are 1-to-1 though, because that's what it says 1-to-1, okay? Now if you're wondering about this has saved my life here. I bought this at the hardware store in the paint section. It just kind of clips down on there, and it doesn't get paint all around the ring of my gallon can, and I love that. You just kind of click it down in there. I poured it in, I put this stuff in, we're ready to go. Of some tape that needs to be pulled off behind the door. I'm not going to touch it right now. I was able to pull the rest off easily, no problem. Be careful if you have to do that. We're done. Like I said, there might be some little issues, last minute, last chance kind of stuff, but I'm pretty happy with it. It looks nice and even for the most part. And remember, this is going to be a driver, so you know, somebody might bang into it or tap it here and there, but we just want to not be too worried about how perfect it is. Now the duster, we might do the same thing. I don't know. We'll see when we get around to that. That's going to get a full sheet metal overhaul anyways, and a lot of the same techniques, products is going to be used on that as well, because that's what we're familiar with here in my mind. And so I'm going to stick with what I know, and I think you should too. Now, if you're going to test on something else that, you know, test panels or anything, then by all means, try new things and expand your universe of paint products. But that is primarily how I utilize 2K primer before and after. You saw both sides of it. And you saw the minimal body work that kind of goes into it, and then the pretty quick prep coming out of it. So just, I guess, remember, if you're confused by what the primers are doing, let me look decent for the camera here. Epoxy primer, which is what you see right here, the gray, in this case, will go on the bare steel when it's clean. Okay, you want clean steel, whether you rust remove, dip it, sandblast, anything. Epoxy primer should go on. You can put your body work as in fillers on top of that, or you can put it straight on the steel. But it is acceptable with epoxy primer to put filler on the primer. Okay? And you can spot prime that as you go, as you're working on it. If it's a slow situation like what I got here, where you do a little here, a little there, and if you got to get out in the weather or in the humidity, you can spot prime it. Not so big a deal on the fiberglass filler, but let's just say fillers in general. And once you get all that under control, you get it where you like it, you feel really good about, good and confident about your body work, then it's time for the 2K. 2K erases a lot of the little scratches you might have, a lot of the very slight lows and things like that. It'll help kind of even that out, because right afterwards you can go ahead and block it just like you saw us do earlier on the tan color. And you can get 2K in gray also. Don't forget that. If that matters to you, you can get it in gray. I like to use the tan because it offsets the contrast of what you're doing from before and after. Okay? And then once you sand that down, it's really fun and easy to sand, really smooth. really soft sanding. Use 320 on that. We evened it out really good. You wipe it down and then you hit it with your seal coat. You can either use sealer or you can use this as a sealer, which is the original epoxy primer. And what it does is it seals off that porosity in the 2K primer. It also seals off any areas where you busted through the 2K or even where you busted through the original epoxy primer. So it's recovering the steel. It's recoating all of that stuff. It's just encapsulating all of that, getting it in one solid unified state. And from this point on this particular portion that we've been working on this video, you can wet sand it with the 320 first and then start increasing your numerical higher grits of paper. You can wet sand, and by the time you paint it, you can get a really slick finish. Okay, so that's what you can do on that. I would suggest wet sanding it, really, because it has a little bit of a texture to it. Not so much orange peel. Some places you could get orange peel, but overall you could really benefit in wet sanding this epoxy primer. Okay, so the next on the docket, we need to do the other side. We probably won't showcase that in the videos. We don't want to confuse and keep doing it over and over. It's redundant. So probably next weekend I'll try to work on that other side and then the other areas whenever necessary or I can, you know. So thanks for coming to the Hoosier Garage. We'll see you next time.